I like it. I get the clap at the start, just in case it's not very good, and then we've got one. At least I can say I had a clap at some point. As you can see here, the name of the talk is Marketing the Movement. Can everyone hear me at the back? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Slightly louder. Yeah. Okay. If I'm shouting too much, just say something. And if I'm too quiet, also just say something, please, because I want everyone to be able to hear. Oh, there we go. I think I'm on the mic. So I entitled this talk "Selling Ourselves Without Selling Out," which are quite charged terms. Maybe that's why so many people came along. But it's not a very controversial talk. What I want to share with you today is stuff that we already know in marketing consumer research, but isn't really getting out of the ivory tower. So things that I'm showing you today aren't necessarily brand new, but they are maybe brand new in terms of things that we can still access and resources that we can still use. And the other thing to think about as well is that marketing and movement are also very highly charged terms. So I'm going to be talking about that today as well. And the premise of my talk, really, to begin with, is that we've already got a lot of knowledge within the movement and a lot of knowledge within various disciplines. My home discipline is marketing consumer research. We already know a lot about how movements work and how they can change markets for the better. But we haven't necessarily been able to get that into application and get that into use within the movements that could benefit the most from it. So I've represented this as an egg in terms of this is what we already have, but there's so much more potential to go. And this is the question that I really want to focus on today. Well, two questions really. The first one is, what can marketing and consumer research teach us already about consumers, activists, movements, and markets? And how can we, and I say we as in the animal rights movement, how can we use this to help ensure that we're selling ourselves, selling our ideas, selling our principles, selling our message, without necessarily selling out to the mass market? And not to ruin the ending, but I want to show you where we're going to get to by the end of the talk so that you can have that in mind as we go, and hopefully kind of keep this in mind on each of the slides that I'm going to show you. This is the model that I'm working with. This is my own model, but it very much captures knowledge that other great thinkers have been putting together. And I've got a reference list at the end if you have any want to do any further reading. But there's really three main models of change in our discipline. There's the movements as conflicts, movements as collaborators, and movements as reconfigurers. I'm going to talk about each of those. And the only one we really want to avoid is this one, which is where the movement kind of capitulates to the market and sells out. So we're thinking about this kind of crescent of goodness where we want to be in one of these three boxes. They all have their pluses and weaknesses, but the one on the bottom left is the one we really want to avoid. So that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. And as you can see, there are two axes, selling out and selling ourselves. And I'm now going to show you where these ideas come from. But the idea really is to move from the bottom right, as you can see, this cat is kind of feeling like they shouldn't have sold out, to the top, where the market and the movement are working in harmony. And there are various different paths that we can take. I'll talk about that as well. But the general idea is we want to move from the bottom left to the top right. We want to move from selling ourselves out and maybe regretting it to hopefully working in harmony with others in the movement and beyond. This is our current understanding of how movements and markets relate. As you can see, it's a mess. So I'm not going to go through it in too much detail, but there's a couple of key points I want to make. Firstly, you'll see that non-humans and humans all live within the bubble of the market. Now, you might say that, that sounds horrible, but actually, if we think about it, billions and trillions of animals do live and die within markets, and even wild animals are affected by markets due to climate change, microplastics, deforestation. So really, none of us can fully escape the market. And this is my position. Maybe I'm biased as a marketing scholar, but my position is the market is there. It's a necessary evil. Unless we have some sort of societal paradigm shift, we need to kind of work with it, but make sure we're working with it in a way that isn't just being kind of used by the market. And as you can see also here, most consumers aren't activists. However, there are a growing number of consumers who are what I would call soft activists, or maybe lapsed activists, latent activists. Every day, we can be an activist by making a choice, by buying a vegan product, by buying a plant-based product, or whatever you want to call it. And for many people, that's as far as their activism goes, but that's going to make a huge difference in terms of shifting economic signals and changing how the market operates. So we need more of those activists. And we also need to think about how we can activate those people to become more active, shall we say, more proactive, more activist. But many of those people won't necessarily become activists in the archetypal sense of going to a protest or being kind of visible or being vocal or raising awareness or social media activism. Many of them may be activists in their professional lives by setting up a new company, by working in an organization, by working as a policymaker. We need all of those people too. So my definition of activism is very, very broad. It's basically anyone who's working in some way and choosing in some way to change the market from what it currently is. And with that broad definition, I think we have a lot of room to grow. And we want to think about how we can make markets work better for the animals. I wouldn't say that everything is to do with marketing, of course. There are things that exist beyond the market, but unfortunately the market is more and more powerful and it kind of influences more and more parts of our lives. I mean, even our dating lives, our romantic lives, our family lives, schools, everything is now dominated by market logics. And I want to really focus on how we can make markets for animals rather than markets of animals or markets that use animals. And this word keeps coming up a lot. So this is the one I'm going to focus on. For those who can't see, it's value. Value is the core word that keeps coming up in our literature, and it actually even came up in the keynote earlier, talking about people's values. And in marketing and consumer research, as you can imagine, we're very interested in value because it's what drives people to buy stuff, or in my case, what drives people to buy less stuff. We've made this definitional distinction between valorization and valuation. So to begin, the word value, it's one of those fuzzy words. It has a lot of meanings, but we would define it mostly in terms of the benefit, the worth of a product, or the benefit of or worth of a person, a service, an experience, a place, or anything. It's its significance, identity. Our value defines our identity as people, or our identity as social media influencers, or our identity as personal brands, or whatever it is. And our value is kind of shaped by these two other bubbles. On the right, we have valorization, which captures moral values, ethical values, what we should do, what we ought to do. It also is intrinsic value. So as a human being, some people would argue that I have intrinsic value in and of myself, not as a tool for other people's use. And of course, animal rights logics tend to try to advocate that we extend that thinking to animals as well. All sentient beings have an intrinsic value. And this also touches on higher order values. When we talk about value, often what we're saying is things like justice, things like family, things like nationhood. Across the whole political spectrum, everyone's thinking and choices are driven by their values, or at least you would hope so. But there's a very different sense of value as well in the marketplace. Market value. Okay, how much is this worth for a brand or a company or an investor? Economic value, the price. Or if it's a streaming service, how much are you going to kind of invest in that to keep streaming? The instrumental value of something, what is this worth to me? What is this person or animal worth to me? Not in its own right, but to me as an instrument. And finally, live value. Okay, the values that we have when we experience something, or the meanings that we attach to something. And when these two things work together, we have a valued outcome, and this is what drives consumption. So if you choose A over B, it's usually because these two things are stronger in A and weaker in B. And of course, there are many, many scenarios where these things come into conflict, and good marketers try to insert their product as the solution to that, okay? So it's, you really want to buy this product, but it's not very environmentally friendly. Well, I've got a product for you that's the same thing, but it's more environmentally friendly. Come and buy my option. So this is basically how marketing works from a value perspective. And we can also extrapolate this over time. So you might buy something once, and if it's really valuable to you and the outcome is good, well, why not buy it again? And this is how people build habits. This is how people build loyalty. This is how people build routine. And over time, it can build and build and build until, as Joy would put it, these choices can become normalized, they can become naturalized, and they can become even necessary. The entire market infrastructure might build around an option so that it becomes the only option, or at least the default option. And for you, you might just see it as normal or even natural to buy this product. And of course, this is where we basically are with meat and dairy on the most part. For a long time, it has been completely naturalized, normalized, and necessitated. So we can think of activism whether that is archetypal activism or professional activism or consumer activism, as trying to disrupt this by providing new forms of value. And if it has value on one side or the other side of the coin, it can drive change. But really what we want is to drive change on both sides of the coin. It's when we can create new choices that are both valorized and valuated. So they have the moral and the market value, the ethical and the economic value, the intrinsic and the instrumental value. That's when you're going to get the vast majority of consumers on board. If you've only got one side, you might get very committed consumers on board. If you have the other side, you might get very kind of instrumental consumers on board, but we want as many consumers on board as possible. I'm going to whiz through this, but basically consumer research has studied this in many different contexts, very rarely with animals. And what we have found is that there's a spectrum of different contexts where this change is easier or harder. And we have different terms to describe this: value assemblages, value networks. These are where changes are really easy to undertake. So we often see this in digital formats, social media. People are quite happy to change what they're consuming on a daily basis. We're probably, unfortunately, at the other end, which is value regimes and value hierarchies. The hierarchy separating humans from non-humans is entrenched over millennia, so it's much harder to shift. And it's built into our infrastructures, our institutions, our ideologies across society in almost every aspect of life. So unfortunately, we're at this end, okay? But we're hoping to maybe move down, and this is all about how do we translate our values as vegans into non-vegan values. How can we have a conversation in different people's language? And again, anyone who was at the keynote will have heard this time and again. I think this is very a recurring conversation topic now. How can we take what we believe and speak in someone else's language to align those two things? And this is what we call value translation in marketing. So back to the model. Having these things in mind, what we need to do is work out how can we actually translate our values without selling out. So something is always lost and gained in translation. We want to gain more for the animals and lose as little as possible. Something will always be lost, but hopefully it's maybe just a term here or there or a word here or there without losing the actual substance of what we want to achieve. And there's three main models of doing this. How much time do I have left? Am I all right? 5 minutes left. Okay, there we go. Thank you. I can wrap this up in 5 minutes. So, let's see. The first model is market conflict. And this is kind of the normal model that we've been operating with for most of the last 30, 40 years. And this, I think, if you spoke to the average person on the street about what activism is, they probably think this is what you're talking about. So you've got this system, carnism, anthropocentrism, speciesism, whatever you've got these choices that consumers are making in the market. They've been making it for a long time. Normalized, naturalized, necessitated. And then some pesky vegan comes along and says, well, that's not really very nice. It's not very moral. It's not very ethical. What about the intrinsic value of the animal? Okay, have you thought about that? Okay, and then, the consumer has to think about it, and they say, hopefully, the vegan is very convincing, and they knock the old way of thinking out. So they cause this kind of moral transformation in the consumer. And of course this happens because if any of you are in the room are vegan, presumably you've had a moral transformation at some point. It might be slow, it might be fast, but you've had one at some point. And this will obviously cause you to value market products very differently. You'll be looking for different things when you're buying products and services. So this is the typical kind of vegan first model, right? We turn people into vegans, then they buy vegan stuff. The vegan market succeeds. But unfortunately, this doesn't always work. So the study that we often talk about in consumer research is downloading. So there was a really good study of how illegal downloading tried to shift what it meant to own music. And for a while they were very successful, but then very powerful interests came in and kind of sued everyone until they were quiet. And then they kind of thought about the model. And they thought, actually, this downloading thing sounds pretty good. So what we're going to do is we're just going to create these new platforms that allow you to stream services instead. And we're going to kind of capture all the goodness out of that, but bring it back into the marketplace. So thank you. So the activists didn't win necessarily. There was a bit of a change, but people who think that music should be free for everyone is kind of a niche position now. So again, we see this a lot with the vegan movement. You can be successful, but at the same time, we can be pushed back into kind of a niche position, and the majority of the market maybe doesn't change as much. The next model is collaboration, which is where we have our alternative ways of thinking, peeking in at the bottom, and we try to then collaborate with the market in order to encourage that. And over time, what was once really alternative maybe gets watered down a little bit, but hopefully we still achieve our aims. And the example that's often given in the literature is food waste. So if you've ever heard of dumpster diving, where people would dive into bins and take food, that was obviously a very alternative way of engaging with food. But over time, the market began to think, okay, there's something going on here that we should work with them on this. And they came up with this kind of different model of recycling, but also reusing products, and refilling is obviously the most recent explanation of this. And the third model, configuration, is basically where someone comes along as a mediator rather than a out-and-out activist. So they're still activists at heart, but maybe they work under the radar, shall we say. And this can happen in many different ways. They can set up a new brand, they can work in government or in policy, they can be a celebrity or a micro-celebrity. I'm not saying they're going to be lying about their vegan beliefs, but they're maybe going to be trying to translate this into other people's language a little bit more. And what we see here then is they have the market valorization, and they try to change the criteria by which people think about what they're already doing, and to try to just subtly reformat people's choices. So it's very similar to the first model, but maybe a bit softer. And this is kind of where people are most excited about at the moment in marketing consumer research. So these are our different boxes. As you can see, if we go from top to bottom, you're selling out more. If you go towards the bottom with collaboration, you're really kind of doing what the market wants more. If you stay at the top, you're doing what you want more. And across the top, it's the degree to which we are really effective in selling ourselves. Unfortunately, the conflict model tends to not be as effective at converting the whole of society. So we tend to have to move across at some point. I've got some tongue-in-cheek advice here, but I think we're running out of time, so I'll talk about that in the Q&A. But I kind of was thinking about, what do we need to do in each of these boxes as a movement? I think we need more professionalizing. We need more avoiding of capitulating to the market. We do need to have some market conflict, but we need to be better at communicating it. And with collaboration, we need to think about how we can kind of equalize, so that when we do collaborate with the market, it's not always the market that wins. You know, there's a kind of more 50-50 split of who wins. And combining this all together, of course, we have a nice acronym, which is very good for marketing, of course. I think we need to really pick up the pace in all of these areas. And on that note, I just want to end with a shameless plug. On the left is my LinkedIn QR code. If you want to follow me on LinkedIn, please do. I'm very happy to continue this conversation. And on the right, we have a fully funded PhD. It's not strictly in the area of veganism, but I just wanted to promote it. It's very much focusing on ecological thinking, well-being, and changing the fashion industry into one that is much more equal in terms of the stakeholders who it considers. So for me, personally, as one of the supervisors, I think there's a clear vegan message that we can slip into that. So if you know anyone who wants to do a PhD, if you want to do a PhD, please come talk to me afterwards or scan the QR code. It's fully funded. You won't have to pay for anything, and we'll pay you 20 grand a year to do it. So there we go. And that's everything. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jack. We've got a few questions on the app, so please keep submitting them, upvoting them as appropriate. The first one is from Isabella. Are you in the room? Just thank you, Isabella. So the question is, understanding the illusion of choice, how do we get markets to increase product accessibility? So for instance, consumers wanting a product but not being able to afford it, markets not making products accessible or affordable due to a lack of demand.
Thank you very much. First, I want to apologize for going maybe 30 seconds over there. I think that was pretty good, though, for timing. So your question's about the illusion of choice. This is something that's very dear to my heart, actually, because everything I teach when I teach students is they come in and they think that they have choices. And they think that as future marketers, future brand leaders, their job is to basically work out what people want and then give it to them. But actually, I come along and say, well, marketing's more about manipulating people and manipulating the market. And I don't mean that necessarily in a negative sense, but our choices are very much shaped by our culture, by our norms. Many of the people in this room are doing research in this area. there is really an illusion of choice. I think your question sounds slightly more pragmatic, though, about making, I guess, vegan or ethical options the default or more accessible or easier. During a cost of living crisis, of course, this is a key issue. And there is also this kind of, I would say, stereotype that veganism is this kind of upper middle class thing, and it's only for people who can afford it. Vegetables aren't that expensive. I mean, they are way more expensive than they should be because of subsidies, but they aren't that expensive. But I think when we think of vegan products, we think of the kind of high-end vegan products. So I think this is a problem of marketing in the sense that they have very much focused on a certain part of the market. And I would personally like to see, as an advocate of EDI, that we keep those products, they're great, but then find other ways to bring more and more people into the movement. And there's some great stuff going on social media at the moment about how to cook vegan products. I think, Chris, your talk was talking about this a couple of weeks ago. How do we kind of just make vegan cooking just normal cooking, basically? And this might be a controversial statement, but I think sometimes that word vegan is not only a strength, but a weakness. I very much try to use the word vegan as much as possible because it makes people think about the animals. But of course, if you say vegan cooking, then people don't necessarily just think of regular cooking as kind of accidentally vegan. So I think when it comes to marketing ourselves, we just need to be very creative in terms of when do we use that word and when do we just maybe hold off on that word. Because if you're saying, let's cook a really delicious meal that happens to be vegan, I think that still achieves the same aims. I don't know if that answers your question. But I think this is a huge area in terms of making these products more accessible. And not only that, making them the default so that people just kind of choose them naturally rather than having to think of them as a separate product.
Thanks, Jack. A question from Nathan, which is raised to the top, probably thanks to the PBU crew for upvoting it. The question is, how can we differentiate between marketing to individuals directly and marketing to institutions, like hospitals or universities, for example, to make change?
This is great. I'm more of a B2C, so business to consumer kind of consumer researcher, but of course there's a whole area of B2B as well. Sorry, who asked the question? So there we go. Hello, I can direct it a bit more to you. I think there's a whole area of marketing about B2B and how do we communicate so if we think of ourselves as the first B, the movement as the business trying to convince others. But personally, and this is purely a personal way of thinking, I think institutions are just built up of individuals. So really, we can try to engage with the institution, but that's quite hard to do. What we really need to do is engage with individuals within the institution who have influence. So if you know someone within the institution, or if you can get to know someone in the institution, I think that's going to be, if you can market to them, that's when you're going to have great success. And of course, we're probably going to have to convince multiple people within an institution in order to make it shift. But I think it's going to be on those one-to-one relationships, just like Melanie Joy said earlier. I think it comes ultimately down to individuals at the end of the day. And those powerful individuals can then shift those institutions. And then just to wrap up the question, we have to remember that everyone is a consumer, whether they like it or not, or at least they have to engage with consumerism in some way. So if you can engage with people as consumers, they can then take that into their professional lives as well. If someone becomes a vegan, they might begin to think about their policy work differently, or they'll think about their journalism differently. Or in my case, I very much began to think about my academic work very differently. So I've kind of been converted and I work within my institution now. So I think it's an individual to individual thing. It all boils down to consumers, but as I said, I'm probably biased.
Time for one more question from Camilla. Just raise your hand. Camilla, thank you. What do you think is the best strategy to change behavior of consumption when it's already been naturalized?
Well, I think, again, I'm biased, but I think that if we look at the model again, I don't think there's one best way of doing it, okay? I think it depends on the individual. It depends on the situation even. It depends on your relationship to the individual. It depends on so many factors. And I know that makes it sound like a very wishy-washy answer. But I think when we can then take all of that complexity and reduce it down to some best practice models, so here we have 3, I'm sure there are more, but there's kind of 3 main models that I've presented very briefly here. I think if you were interacting with someone, you need to think, okay, is this the best time to really directly address the moral issues in the room? Would that work with this particular person? Maybe yes, maybe no. Would it be better to maybe collaborate with them? Okay, they have these needs. I can align veganism to those needs. How can we work together? Do I have a working relationship with them? If you don't, is there a way that I can maybe configure their choices, even in a way that they're not necessarily kind of saliently thinking about, to just make them vegan by default? So it really depends on the situation that we're talking about. But I think the good thing about that is if we had one best model, then basically it either succeeds or fails. And if it fails, then that's it. But I think if we have a whole toolbox of best models or good models, and if we all know what these different tools are and we have them in the back of our mind, I think we're all going to be much more successful advocates because we can get out the right tool for the right job. And yes, we're going to get it wrong sometimes. And yes, maybe we've only got access to certain tools. But as a movement, I hope that we have access to all the tools and all the different situations that we need. So really the point of my talk today was just to say, there's a lot of knowledge already out there. We just need to be sharing it with each other a bit more and then having that arsenal behind us that we can use on a day-by-day basis in each of the different situations that we encounter. I think that's where we'll be most successful. Hopefully that answered your question. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jack. That's all we've got time for this morning. The next talk will be on the civil service and animal protection starting in 5 minutes in this room. Otherwise, Dr. Jack Wiverley, thank you very much.